Luke tightened his grip on the coffee mug as he stared at the joint account statement displayed on his laptop screen. He wasn't a man prone to suspicion, but the numbers didn't lie. The charges for luxury items and expensive dinners had been increasing over the past few months. Rachel had always had a taste for the finer things in life, but this was uncharacteristically extravagant, even for her. He pulled up the receipts one by one. A designer handbag, a lavish dinner at a restaurant they'd never been to together, and, most damning of all, a hotel stay. The dates aligned with the nights Rachel claimed to be working late or meeting friends. Luke's chest tightened as he recalled those evenings. He had always trusted her without question, but now he replayed every excuse, every detail she had offered, searching for the cracks in her story. A small part of him wanted to dismiss it all as a misunderstanding, but the evidence was mounting, and his gut screamed that something was wrong. Luke reached for his phone and opened a search engine, typing in the name of the hotel. The images confirmed it was a five-star establishment, with rooms that cost more per night than his monthly car payment. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, the tension in his chest spread to his shoulders and neck, a relentless weight pressing down on him. Was this really happening? Was Rachel, the woman he had built a life with, the person he thought he knew best, capable of such betrayal? Luke's hands trembled slightly as he grabbed the pile of unopened mail on the counter. Sifting through it, he found the bank statements Rachel had filed away without showing him. His heart sank further as he scanned the charges. The same pattern appeared. Exorbitant expenses tied to dates he now recognized. The clincher came in the form of an email alert. It was an automatic notification for a new credit card account, one he didn't recognize. His suspicions solidified into certainty. Rachel was siphoning their joint resources for her double life, using their hard-earned money to fund something. His mind turned to the night she had come home late, her perfume a little too strong, her demeanor just a bit too light. It was all starting to make sense now. Luke's breath quickened as the anger boiled within him. He wasn't just angry at Rachel. He was furious with himself for not seeing it sooner, for letting her deceive him. But Luke wasn't a man who wallowed in self-pity. He was practical, a problem solver. If Rachel thought she could exploit his trust and get away with it, she was sorely mistaken. He pulled out his notebook, the one he used for keeping track of household expenses, and began jotting down a plan. Step 1, confirm the betrayal. Step 2, protect himself financially. Step 3, make Rachel understand the gravity of her actions. By the time Rachel came home that evening, Luke was calm, composed, and ready to act. "How was your day?" he asked as she breezed through the door, her hair falling in perfect waves over her shoulders. "Exhausting," she replied, kissing his cheek. "I'm starving. What's for dinner?" "Whatever you're in the mood for," Luke said, his voice steady, his eyes searching hers for the lies she didn't know he had already uncovered. This was just the beginning, he thought. Soon, Rachel would learn that she wasn't the only one capable of playing a game. The next morning, Luke woke early, his mind still buzzing with the revelations from the previous night. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee while flipping through the stack of bank statements. His phone rested beside him, vibrating occasionally with notifications he ignored. This wasn't the time for distractions. Luke's years as a financial analyst had taught him how to spot patterns, and Rachel's spending told a story he wished he didn't have to read. She wasn't just careless with their money, she was meticulous in covering her tracks. Transactions were scattered across multiple accounts and carefully disguised. Boutique shopping sprees were tagged as gifts. And what infuriated him more was the brazenness of her actions. She had clearly underestimated him, assuming he would remain oblivious. Luke smirked grimly. She might have been playing her little game, but now he was joining the board and rewriting the rules. After hours of digging, he found the connection he was searching for. Tyler. His name was linked to a transfer from their joint account, something Rachel had labeled consulting fees. The name triggered a memory. Tyler was the man Rachel had mentioned once or twice in passing, a friend from work. At the time, Luke hadn't thought much of it. Now, the name was a glaring red flag. Luke leaned back in his chair, staring at the laptop screen. The man had a social media presence, of course. Photos of him lounging by pools, dining at exclusive restaurants, and driving sports cars he clearly couldn't afford on his own salary. Luke had seen his type before, a leech, feeding off anyone foolish enough to let him. His frustration reached a peak when he found a photo of Tyler and Rachel at a rooftop bar. It was a casual snapshot, the kind you take with an old friend, if that friend wasn't draping an arm around your wife's waist. The caption read, "Living the good life, work hard, play hard." Luke's jaw clenched. It wasn't enough to confirm the affair in his gut. He needed undeniable proof. That was the only way to corner Rachel. He decided to enlist the help of a private investigator, a professional who could track Rachel's activities without tipping her off. It wasn't a decision he made lightly, but he had to know the full scope of her betrayal. Later that day, Luke visited the bank. The polished floors and hushed atmosphere did little to calm his nerves as he approached the teller. "I need to make some changes to my accounts," he said, his voice steady but firm. Over the next hour, Luke transferred all joint funds into an account solely in his name. He left Rachel with just enough to cover any essential bills for the month. Not that she deserved even that much. As the bank manager finalized the paperwork, Luke asked a few more pointed questions about the joint account. He learned that Rachel had been making cash withdrawals frequently, large amounts that weren't reflected in her usual spending patterns. His heart sank. She wasn't just splurging, she was siphoning their savings into something untraceable. On the drive home, Luke's mind raced with possibilities. What else had she done? Was Tyler her only accomplice, or were there others? Had she been planning to leave him all along, hoping to bleed him dry first? The house was empty when he returned, Rachel having left for her usual afternoon yoga class, or so she said. Luke took the opportunity to search her belongings. He wasn't proud of it, but this wasn't about privacy anymore. It was about protecting himself. Tucked into the bottom of her wardrobe beneath a stack of carefully folded sweaters, Luke found an envelope stuffed with receipts. Some were for purchases he'd already seen in their account statements, but others revealed new details. Spa visits, vacations, even a down payment on a villa he'd never heard of. Each slip of paper was another nail in the coffin of their marriage. Luke stood in the middle of their bedroom, holding the envelope, his mind churning with a mix of anger and disbelief. He couldn't decide what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the meticulous effort Rachel had put into hiding it. By the time she walked through the door that evening, her hair damp from the shower and her face glowing with the post-workout flush he once found endearing, Luke had made up his mind. The confrontation would come soon, but not yet. He needed to see this through carefully, to let her believe she was still in control. For now, he greeted her with a warm smile, masking the storm brewing inside him. "How was yoga?" he asked, keeping his tone light. "It was great," she replied, setting her gym bag by the door. "You should join me sometime." "Ooh, I'll think about it," Luke said, the edge of irony in his voice completely lost on her. The groundwork was laid. Luke was ready to expose Rachel for who she truly was, but he wasn't going to rush. Timing was everything, and when the moment came, he would make sure it hit her where it hurt the most. Luke sat in the dim light of his home office, a room that had become his refuge in the weeks since his discovery. His laptop screen glowed with emails from the private investigator he'd hired, each filled with more damning evidence of Rachel's betrayal. Photographs, videos, and even phone logs painted a picture too vivid to ignore. Tyler wasn't just a fleeting affair. He was an accomplice in siphoning their shared life into Rachel's secret world. For days, Luke had meticulously pieced together the puzzle. Every receipt, transfer, and message had been documented, filed, and cross-referenced. He wanted to ensure that when the time came, Rachel would have no room for denial or manipulation. The folder containing the evidence was thick now, a tangible testament to her deceit. One email in particular gnawed at him. The investigator had found bookings for an upcoming vacation, a luxury resort in the Caribbean, paid for entirely out of their joint account. The departure date was just a week away. Luke couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Oh, she had been so brazen, so certain that her web of lies would hold long enough to enjoy a getaway with her lover. But Rachel wasn't the only one with plans. Set in the stage. Luke's first order of business was to secure his finances completely. His visit to the bank had been a decisive first step, but now he took it further. He moved funds into a new account Rachel couldn't access and redirected all his earnings there. His credit cards were replaced, passwords updated, and legal consultations arranged. Luke wasn't just cutting her off, he was ensuring she couldn't sabotage him when her schemes unraveled. Next, he began preparing the house. Rachel had always been particular about her possessions, carefully curating every aspect of their home. Luke decided to leave her with a poignant reminder of what she was losing. He boxed up items he knew were hers, neatly labeling them and stacking them in the guest room. It wasn't spite, it was a message. This chapter was closing, and she was no longer a part of it. The mornings passed quietly, each day bringing him closer to his confrontation with Rachel. She seemed blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath Luke's composed exterior. Her days were spent out of the house, her evenings filled with forced small talk and laughter that no longer reached her eyes. Luke played along, though each interaction felt like walking on a tightrope. He allowed himself small victories, catching her in a lie about where she had been, watching her scramble for an explanation when he asked an innocent-sounding question about a non-existent, uncovering the full. One night, after Rachel had fallen asleep, Luke sat at the dining table with her phone in his hand. The private investigator had provided a way to access her cloud backups, a trove of messages, photos, and even deleted files. Luke hesitated for a moment, then tapped into the folder. The messages were worse than he imagined. Tyler and Rachel weren't just sharing secrets. They were mocking him, discussing how clueless he was, and making plans for their future together. Tyler had even suggested that Rachel push for a divorce, framing it as a mutual decision while ensuring she walked away with as much of Luke's money as possible. Luke's hands shook as he read, but he forced himself to stay calm. Anger wouldn't serve him now. Clarity and control would. He screenshot the most incriminating exchanges, adding them to his growing file of evidence. One video caught his attention. It was a short clip, barely 10 seconds, but it showed Rachel at a dinner with Tyler, laughing as she toasted to freedom and new beginnings. Luke couldn't decide what stung more, her words or the ease with which she discarded their years together. The twist. By the end of the week, Luke had finalized his plan. On the morning Rachel was set to leave for her Caribbean escapade, he arranged a meeting with her at the dining table. He had laid out the folder of evidence, each piece carefully placed to maximize its impact. Rachel came downstairs dressed impeccably, her suitcase already packed by the door. "What's all this?" she asked, gesturing to the folder. "Sit down," Luke said, his tone even but firm. Her smile faltered. "I don't have time for a long conversation. My flight—" "Rachel." Luke's voice cut through her excuse like a knife. Reluctantly, she obeyed. Luke began slowly, laying out the evidence piece by piece. First came the receipts, then the bank statements, followed by the photos and videos. Rachel's face went from feigned confusion to outright panic. "This isn't what it looks like," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Then explain it to me," Luke said, his tone icy. She reached for the folder, but Luke pulled it away. "No," he said. "You don't get to touch this. You don't get to rewrite what's already been written." Rachel's excuses came in rapid-fire succession. She was lonely. She didn't mean for it to happen. Tyler had manipulated her. But Luke didn't flinch. "I trusted you," he said. "You used that trust to gut our marriage, our life." As she tried to plead her case, Luke dropped the final bombshell. "By the way, I've already emptied our accounts. The only thing left in your name is the debt you've racked up. If Tyler's willing to foot the bill..." Rachel stared at him, her face a mixture of shock and fury. "You can't do this," she cried. "I already have," Luke said, standing and gathering the folder. "And you're going to learn, Rachel. Actions have consequences." Luke walked out of the house, leaving her alone with the evidence of her betrayal and the weight of what she had lost. Rachel sat frozen at the dining table, staring at the damning evidence Luke had left behind. Her chest heaved with short, panicked breaths as the magnitude of her situation began to sink in. The once flawless web of lies she had spun now lay in tatters, exposed under the harsh light of Luke's calculated precision. For the first time in months, Rachel felt the cold sting of vulnerability. She had believed herself untouchable, a master of manipulation who could juggle Tyler's arrogance, Luke's naivety, and her own desires without consequence. But Luke had proven her wrong in spectacular fashion, dismantling her plans with a calm ruthlessness that left her reeling. The first crack came when she checked her bank account. The joint account was a reliable source of funds, was empty. She tried accessing her other accounts, but the passwords had been changed. The credit cards she'd used to support her lavish lifestyle were now frozen. "Damn it," Rachel cursed under her breath, slamming her phone onto the table. Her mind raced as she considered her options. She reached for her phone again, hesitating before dialing Tyler's number. Would he even answer? Lately, he had grown distant, less attentive, more preoccupied with what he called big plans. She had dismissed it as his usual bravado, but now she wondered if his promises of security and support were as hollow as they suddenly felt. After a few rings, Tyler picked up. "Hey, babe," he said, his voice casual. "Luke knows everything," Rachel blurted out, her voice trembling. There was a long pause on the other end. "What do you mean everything?" Tyler's tone had shifted, the easy charm replaced by wary defensiveness. "You strained the accounts, Tyler, all of them. He has evidence, photos, bank statements, messages. I don't know how he got it all, but he did. He knows about us." Tyler sighed. "Well, that's unfortunate." Rachel's heart sank. "Unfortunate? That's all you have to say?" "What do you want me to say, Rachel?" Tyler snapped. "I warned you about pushing too hard, about taking too much. You've made this mess, and now you want me to clean it up?" The words hit her like a slap. "You said we were in this together, that you'd take care of me if anything happened." "I said I'd take care of you if you played it smart," Tyler retorted. "But now you're telling me your husband has a mountain of evidence and you're broke? That's not smart, Rachel." She felt the tears welling up but refused to let them fall. "So what now? You're just going to abandon me?" Tyler sighed again, this time with the exasperation of someone who had already made up his mind. "Look, I need to think. I can't just drop everything because you've screwed up. I'll call you later." And with that, he hung up. Rachel stared at her phone in disbelief, her fingers trembling as she redialed his number. This time, it went straight to voicemail. "No, coward!" she muttered, throwing the phone across the room. The ripple effect? The fallout from Luke's actions was immediate and merciless. Rachel's friends, many of whom she had confided in during her affair, began to distance themselves. The whispers at yoga class, the pointed glances at her favorite cafe, it all made her painfully aware that her private scandal was quickly becoming public knowledge. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages, some from well-meaning acquaintances offering sympathy, others from mutual friends of Luke's expressing their shock and disappointment. One message stood out, a curt text from Luke himself. "The lawyer will contact you tomorrow regarding the divorce. Do not call me unless it's an emergency." Rachel felt the weight of those words settle over her like a shroud. Divorce. It was a word she had toyed with in her mind, a possibility she thought she could control when the time was right. But now it was happening on Luke's terms, not hers. She tried to imagine life without him, the steady anchor he had always been, the quiet strength she had taken for granted. The house, her sanctuary of comfort and luxury, would undoubtedly be his. She couldn't even picture herself in a smaller, less opulent space, much less affording one. Desperation clawed at her as she paced the living room, her thoughts a chaotic whirl. Tyler had turned his back on her. Luke had cut her off. The life she had so carefully constructed was unraveling faster than she could hold it together. A bitter realization. Late that night, Rachel sat on the edge of their bed, the bed she had shared with Luke, and, in her darkest moments, with the man who had helped destroy her life. She stared at the empty closet where Luke's clothes had once hung, the absence a glaring reminder of her choices. She picked up a photo from the nightstand, one of her and Luke on their honeymoon. They were younger, carefree, their smiles wide and genuine. She traced her finger over Luke's face, the memory of who they had been together crashing over her like a wave. For the first time, Rachel allowed herself to feel the full weight of her actions. Not just the loss of money or comfort, but the loss of Luke. He had loved her unconditionally, trusted her implicitly, and she had thrown it all away. She thought about the man who had once written her love notes and planned surprise weekend getaways, the man who had built a life with her brick by brick. She had traded that man for fleeting thrills, and now she was left with nothing but regret. As the dawn light filtered through the curtains, Rachel made her way to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. She stood there in silence, the realization sinking in. Luke had won. Not just the financial battle, but the moral one as well. He had walked away with his dignity intact, while she was left picking up the pieces of a shattered life. But Rachel wasn't the type to wallow in self-pity for long. If she had learned anything from Luke's calculated response, it was that survival demanded resilience. She didn't know how yet, but she would rebuild, even if she had to start from the ground up. Luke stepped out of the courthouse, his footsteps echoing on the stone steps as he made his way into the crisp afternoon air. The divorce proceedings had been swift and resolute, thanks to the meticulous preparation he put into gathering evidence. Rachel hadn't even contested most of the terms. Her attorney's half-hearted attempts to negotiate were quickly dismissed by the judge, who clearly saw the futility of her case. The weight Luke had been carrying for months began to lift, replaced by a bittersweet sense of closure. The life he had built with Rachel was over, but he wasn't leaving empty-handed. He still had his career, his home, and most importantly, his self-respect. As he walked toward his car, a familiar face approached. It was Mark, his best friend since college. "How do you feel?" Mark asked, leaning casually against Luke's car. "Lighter," Luke replied after a moment, his voice calm. "It's strange. I thought I'd feel more anger or sadness, but mostly I just feel done." Mark nodded. "That's what happens when you know you've made the right call. You didn't just get out of a toxic marriage, you took control of your life." Luke appreciated the words, but he didn't linger on them. He was already looking ahead. Rachel's perspective. Back at her temporary apartment, Rachel sat at the small kitchen table, staring blankly at the email from her lawyer. It outlined the final terms of the divorce settlement, a stark reminder of how far she'd fallen. The villa, the joint accounts, the savings, it was all gone. She was left with a modest alimony payment that would barely cover her new lifestyle. Tyler, predictably, had vanished the moment the money dried up. His promises of support and partnership had turned out to be nothing more than empty words. Rachel had tried reaching out, but her calls went unanswered, her messages ignored. The man she had risked everything for had disappeared without so much as an apology. The apartment, with its mismatched furniture and barren walls, felt like a prison. Rachel hadn't worked in years, relying instead on Luke's steady income to support her. Now, faced with the daunting reality of independence, she was paralyzed. Where would she go from here? How would she rebuild a life that had crumbled under her own choices? She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, her reflection a haunting reminder of what she had become. The elegant, composed woman she once prided herself on being was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized. For the first time, Rachel allowed herself to acknowledge the full extent of her loss, not just the material comforts, but Luke himself. His quiet strength, his unwavering support, the love he had given her so freely. She had thrown it all away for a fleeting illusion of excitement. Luke's new path. In the weeks following the divorce, Luke focused on rebuilding his life. The house, once a shared space filled with memories, was now his alone. He redecorated, not out of bitterness, but to reclaim it as his own. Gone were the pieces Rachel had chosen. In their place were items that reflected Luke's taste. Simple, practical, and comforting. He also reconnected with old friends and hobbies he'd neglected during the marriage. Weekend hikes, evenings spent woodworking in the garage, and spontaneous dinners with colleagues reminded him of the joys of a life unencumbered by deceit. One evening, as Luke sorted through a box of old photos, he came across a picture of himself and Rachel from their early years. They were smiling, carefree, their whole lives ahead of them. For a moment, he felt a pang of nostalgia, but it was fleeting. That version of Rachel was gone, replaced by someone he no longer recognized. He set the photo aside and picked up his phone. A message from a new acquaintance, Emily, lit up the screen. They had met at a mutual friend's party a few weeks ago, and their conversations had been easy, unforced. She was kind, intelligent, and refreshingly straightforward, qualities Luke had come to value deeply. "Dinner this weekend," her message read. Luke smiled and typed back, looking forward to it, Rachel's attempt at redemption. Rachel eventually started taking steps to rebuild her own life. It wasn't easy. Finding work with her limited skills and a resume full of gaps proved challenging. But she managed to land a part-time job at a local boutique, a far cry from the luxury she was used to, but a necessary first step. She began attending therapy, something she had always dismissed during her marriage. The sessions were painful, forcing her to confront her choices and the damage they had caused, but they also provided clarity. Slowly, she began to understand the emptiness she had tried to fill with Tyler and material indulgence. Rachel knew she couldn't undo the past, but she hoped to carve out a future that was more honest, even if it was humbler. She reached out to Luke once, sending a carefully worded letter apologizing for her actions and acknowledging the pain she had caused. Luke read the letter but didn't respond. He appreciated her acknowledgement, but he was focused on his new life. A life untainted by betrayal. Moving forward, as winter turned to spring, both Luke and Rachel found themselves on separate paths of growth and discovery. For Luke, the future was bright with possibility, a blank slate waiting to be filled with new experiences and meaningful connections. For Rachel, the journey was slower and fraught with challenges, but she was beginning to understand the value of self-reliance and accountability. In the end, their marriage became a cautionary tale of trust and betrayal, a lesson in the consequences of choices made and the resilience of the human spirit.